Hey guys, it's Loaf, back with some more Last Epoch content. Sorry for the long absence of videos. As Last Epoch started to get a little bit slower, I decided to go on vacation with my family and relax a little bit. That way I was prepared to put in the long hours once the new cycle started. We did start streaming again today. We did about 5.5 hours of just theory crafting stream, just grabbing chat's ideas and trying to put them into full-fledged builds. So I wanted to make a quick video showcasing kind of the most asked question I got on stream today, which was, what am I planning on starting off with the cycle? What class, what build? So I wanted to help answer some of those questions, show you guys what I plan on playing, as much as I can at least. There is a lot of new tech that's not available yet on the current Last Epoch 1.0. And while I do play on the test servers, I can't record any of that footage or go into too much detail on some of those things. So I'm going to show you what I can so far and give you as much information as possible. And then as we get closer to the cycle start in the first day or two, I can release a longer, more in-depth video that's kind of similar to low fashion videos there, where they're a couple hours long going into all the nitty gritty. But this will at least give you guys an idea of what we're working with and explain the mechanics, and hopefully that will help you have a successful league start if you're planning on playing along with me. So let's go ahead and get into the video. All right, so the first thing I wanted to tackle that I'm sure a lot of people would ask if I didn't address it right at the beginning is, are you going to be cycle starting the Mana Lightning Rune Master? The answer to that, sadly, is no. Um, while I'm trying not to take it too personally and think of it more as a compliment for the success of the build, EHG did nerf Mana Lightning like 8 different ways. They nerfed its defenses and its damage, and just the comfortability of the build has all been nerfed. So they had nerfed a bunch of the Rune Master passives as a whole, adding cooldowns to proc some of them, lowering the numerical values of some of them. So the overall ward generation got nerfed by quite a bit, including just overall ward itself at high values also getting nerfed. On top of that, the runic invocation that we use to get a massive amount of ward and also damage reduction had the damage reduction portion of it completely removed. So there was a huge layer of defense just cut out of the build. And then as the cherry on top, the node closed circuit and lightning blast that allowed us to stack our crit chance extremely fast with the insane amounts of cast speed that we would put on the build, now has been nerfed and made so it can no longer stack. So that killed all of our crit chance. Now we have to sacrifice a whole bunch of damage stats to now put a crit chance on all of our gear in order to try to get as close to 100% crit chance as possible. It'll still be a decent-ish build. It's going to be, kind of mid-tier. It's just not going to be a top-tier build anymore. So it's just not something I plan on starting my cycle off with. I would like to start off with a little bit more of a bang, try to rush to the new boss as fast as possible. So no, I will not be starting Mana Lightning Rune Master. I apologize. So if I am not playing Mana Lightning Rune Master, what am I playing? I wanted to stay true to to my heart here, and I did want to start off with a mage, even if it wasn't Rune Master. But I am going to be starting off with a sorcerer build, and it is still going to have all of that lightning explosion goodness that we have all fallen in love with last cycle. So none of that will be left out for my cycle starter. I promise you that. So the summary of the build, so you can get kind of an idea before I break down all of the nuance and detail of the character, is I am going to be mana stacking for both my offense and my defense. That is why my health, it looks so low on the build planner. This is kind of a fairly budget-friendly setup. Uniques will be much easier to get into the new cycle, so don't worry too much about that, as well as there's going to be a lot of chase items with different LP on it that you can go for in the end game. This is kind of just the easy to throw together stuff that I put on the planner. So it's going to be centering around Fragment of the Enigma. Of course, this is my baby. I wasn't going to start the next cycle without it. So we're going to be doing a lot of spark charge explosions. stacking intelligence where we can. And then the new piece to the puzzle here, I think it's pronounced Tribo Electra. I'm not sure exactly, but it's a new wand that we're getting. And what it does is it adds +3 to levels of lightning spell skills. It makes your static orb tendrils. It gives you a lot more of them, so it gives you an extra 2 to 5 tendrils, which can all apply spark charges. And then the big part here is when you use the new evade skill that every character gets by default, it is going to automatically cast static orb for you, and it's going to be at 90% of its mana cost. So it's going to save you a little bit of mana, and it's also going to function as more of an auto bomber type character. So keep that in mind. And then we'll be pairing that with the new Phantom Grip rings just for easy crit chance, as they do give you base crit chance on rings and the easy increased mana cost. These rings are super common, very easy to get. So these should be dropping like crazy as you're going through the campaign. So that's the general idea of it, is creating these massive lightning explosions that are automatically casting with static orb, and then just having big detonations with the spark charges for area clear. But without further ado, let's go ahead and we'll start breaking down the skill tree, and that way you can start getting an idea for how everything's functioning with the build. Alrighty guys, let's go ahead and get into the first skill. So for our first skill, we're going to be using Static Orb. This is going to be the main damage for the build. What this will do is it casts an orb in a target direction that deals lightning damage as it hits enemies, and then once it hits the targeted location, it explodes to do an additional lightning damage. So I do have sliders here for all of the skills, so you guys can kind of follow along. The leveling process is to kind of make it easier. Just so you guys are aware, and a reminder, I do plan on playing a early leveling build that is slightly different from this. So I don't plan on starting out right out the gate with Static Orb. One, I won't have access to it yet, and two, it will take a little bit of synergy before I get to that point. So just keep that in mind. But this is how I would level the skill. So for the first point, we're going to take a traveling point to Shocking Conduit. This will give us some shock chance, which is good. We won't have to get this elsewhere. We will also be taking 1 point into Insidious Focus as a travel point. It is going to reduce the mana cost a little bit. The downside is it does take away the pull-in effect that Static Orb does typically have, but it is necessary to pick these up. Grab the 3 points into Orbital Fulmination. What this does is, instead of shooting the Static Orb in front of you and then exploding, it instead makes the orb travel around you, kind of like hammer throw spiral works, so it can repeatedly hit enemies. And then once it hits its maximum distance, it will then explode. This way you can get a lot more hits per cast. The reason why this is important, as we'll get into the further nodes on the tree, is our static orb is going to be costing quite a bit of mana. So we want to get the most bang for our buck with the mana cost and make sure we're getting a few hits in with each static orb cast. All right, for the next point, we're going to put 1 point into Forking Surge. What this does is it makes the explosion create little lightning tendrils to hit enemies outside the explosion area. This is going to give us +2 tendrils, and then we're also going to get an additional +5 from the wand that we talked about earlier to apply a lot of the spark charges for us. This is going to be necessary to gain access over to Volatile Outbursts. The reason why this is so good is it gives us a damage ramp. The further Static Orb travels, the more damage it will get, up to a 90% more multiplier, which is really big. And then on top of that, it's going to reduce the projectile speed slightly. It's actually kind of a good thing. Since it's orbiting us, it will keep it kind of closer to us to hit the enemies in the nearby vicinity a few more times before it hits that maximum distance it can travel. After that, we'll be grabbing 2 points into Static Armor. This is going to guarantee give us Lightning Aegis every time we cast Static Orb. What Lightning Aegis does is it increases your overall lightning damage by 50%, and it makes you take 25% less damage. So this putting 2 points in there will give us a comfy 4 seconds of Lightning Aegis. You should have your evade up every few seconds, so you should have 100% uptime on Lightning Aegis with these two nodes. Next up, we'll take the 3 points into Open Circuit. What this does is it gives us plus 30% projectile speed, so it kind of counteracts the reduced projectile speed from Volatile Outburst. And then it gives us 15% more damage. But more importantly, it gives us access to the Scatter Blast node. What this will do is when you're casting Static Orb, it will send out these smaller orbs next to the larger orb that will also do damage to enemies that it passes through, just giving us more bang for our buck with each cast, making it a lot easier to area clear and more hits to be applying our spark charges. Next up is going to be the big damage nodes. We're going to be putting 5 points into Mana Charge. So the reason why I take these so late is because it typically takes a little while for you to build up a large mana pool for these to really make sense to do. So how it works is Static Orbs deals more damage per 20 maximum mana, but Static Orb costs more mana equal to a portion of your maximum mana. So at 5 points, Static Orb is going to be costing 20% of our maximum mana. So we can only get out 5 of these before we're out of mana. We're going to have a couple of things in our passive tree and some tech that we're doing, some other skills that will help sustain this mana cost, so don't worry too much about that. But we get that 5% more multiplier per 20 maximum mana. So with 1,000 plus mana, that's a lot of extra damage coming through. And then for our final points, we're going to be putting 2 points into Fusion Blast here. So after using a static orb, the next lightning blast you cast from any source chains 2 additional times. And then we'll be putting 1 point into Atomic Manipulation. So for 4 seconds after using static orb, directly casting lightning blast and hitting at least one enemy will return 25% of static orb's mana cost. So the reason why that's important is to help sustain some of the mana increase or mana charge. So every time you use Evade, you're just going to tap or Lightning Blast once, and it's going to return a chunk of that mana back to you. So that is one of the pieces of tech that we'll be using to kind of help sustain the cost for the build. And then that will kind of wrap up the starting section of Static Orb. Later on, when we get better gear and we make another video, we'll go over to some places where you can get some extra points once you start getting the levels to Static Orb. For the second skill, we have Lightning Blast, our baby from last cycle. We're bringing it back with a little bit of changes into the skill tree. So to start us off, we'll grab our slider here, and our first 2 points are going to go into Storm Razor. That's going to give us some increased base crit and some more damage multiplier there. But mainly, we are using them as travel nodes so we can get into our next 3 points. After that, we'll be putting 2 points into Chain Lightning. What this does is it makes Lightning Blast chain additional times, but it costs more mana. So instead of using the Arcing Power like we used to, this one is just going to give us the chains on every single cast, no matter what. There's no build up for that. So we just have 2 additional chains for 6 extra mana cost. With how massive our mana pool is, you're not even going to notice the mana cost whatsoever. And then what it also gives us access to is Convergence. So Lightning Blast now hits the same target after a delay, but no longer chains to additional enemies. And then Lightning Blast chains half as many times rounded up. So instead of chaining to a whole bunch of different enemies and applying spark charges to all of them, we're going to be hitting one target really, really fast without hardly any investment into cast speed, applying a whole bunch of spark charges to them. Next up, we will be grabbing the 4 points into Overcharge. What this does, it gives you a 24% chance to double cast Lightning Blast. So that includes Lightning Blast and all of its chains that are also going to be casting on top of the same target. All of those are going to be doubled, and then it gives you a 40% critical strike multiplier. Next up, we'll grab Hypercharge, which does the same thing, except instead of casting it twice, it's going to cast or the Lightning Blast 4 times. So there's a 25% chance it quadruple casts. All right. Any of you guys that have played my previous build with the Mad Lightning Master, none of this is going to be new to you. We're going to be taking the 2 travel points in front loaded. That's going to give us a little bit of increased damage for Lightning Blast, a little bit less bonus damage per chain. But the big ticket is it's going to give us access to Cloud Answer. What this does is it gives us a 30% chance on hit with Lightning Blast to apply a Spark Charge. Spark Charge is a negative ailment that applies on an enemy, and after, I believe it is 1 second, it creates a lightning explosion that is going to do AoE damage to everything around it. So that is going to be the majority of our AoE clear is going to be coming from the Spark Charges. We'll get into how we scale that damage a little bit later on with some of the item choices and some of the next passive points we're going to be taking here. After that, we'll be taking the 5 points into Mortal Capacitator. What that does is it amplifies the Spark Charge damage coming from Lightning Blast by 200%. And then next, we'll be putting 1 point into Final Spark. So how that functions is if Lightning Blast hits an enemy that's already affected by a Spark Charge, instead of waiting for the Spark Charge to naturally explode on the target, it's going to immediately detonate it, and then it can be free to apply more Spark Charges to that same target. It's going to be really important when we're casting a whole bunch of these chains on the same target and quadruple casting, just constantly be exploding the pre-existing Spark Charges on that target. And then for the last couple points, we're going to be putting them into Chained Lightning to get some extra chains on top of that so we can just have more explosions triggering. For the third skill, we're going to be using Flame Ward. So pretty much every mage build under the sun uses this skill. What it does, you activate it and it creates a barrier of 400 ward over your health pool. And then for 3 seconds, hits deal 30% less damage to you. How we're going to be leveling this out, the first 3 points, we're going to be putting it into Dilation. It's going to increase the duration by 36% and increase the mana efficiency by 18%. That will allow us to have that damage reduction for a longer amount of time. Next up, we'll be putting the 2 points into Energize. It's going to give us an additional 30 ward per second while Flame Ward is active. And then after that, we'll be putting the 3 points into Prismatic Buffer. So in addition to the 30% less damage that you take, you will also take 30% less elemental damage. After that, we'll go over to Barrier, take the 5 points there. So in addition to those previous 2 damage reductions, you are also going to be taking 40% less hit damage from all sources. After that, we'll be taking 2 points into Recollection. This will give us 50% ward retention. How ward retention works is your ward naturally wants to decay over time. This will help make it so it doesn't decay as fast. We're still going to be a kind of ward and mana centric build. So we're going to go over, once we get to the passive tree, how we're generating some different sources of ward to kind of protect our health pool. Next, we'll be taking 2 traveling points into Shrewd Shielding, which makes the mana efficiency of Flame Ward 20% better. Then we'll be putting the remaining 3 points into Mental Aegis. What this does is mana now absorbs damage while Flame Ward is active. Each point of mana shields 5 health and ward. So before we take any damage to our health or ward, it is also going to redistribute 30% of that damage to our mana pool. And since we have such a large mana pool, it is going to be a lot more effective at keeping us alive. So that's going to be one of the main defenses that we have with this build. We will be getting more of this stat later on in the build once we get into some of the items and some of the passives in the passive tree. And that will wrap up the Flame Ward skill. For the next skill, we have our movement ability, which is going to be Flame Rush. How Flame Rush works is you put your mouse in a certain direction, you hold down the key, it turns you into a ball of flame, which you take 40% less damage while you are in it, and then it sends you forward, going slower the longer you hold down the key. How we're going to be leveling this out, we're going to be taking the first 2 points into Fiery Overload. This is going to give us Frenzy once we exit Flame Rush, which is going to give us increased cast speed. After that, we'll be taking 1 point to Lunar Protection for now. That's going to give us 30 ward per second during Flame Rush. And then once we finish Flame Rush, it's going to give us an additional 60 ward as like a big burst. After that, we'll be taking the 1 point into Energy Equivalence. This is going to change the base damage of the fire over to lightning. So we're going to be a lightning ball instead of a fireball. And then more importantly, it's just going to give us access to Beta Decay. What this does is Flame Rush now also casts Static Orb in the opposite direction. And then this will consume 80% of static orbs mana cost as well. So we're going to get a little bit reduced mana cost, but the big part here is it fires it in the opposite direction. Normally that would be a bad thing. However, because of the static orb node's orbital fulmination that makes static orb orbit around us, it is actually not going to really have a downside. It's still going to cast the same static orb. It's just going to start circling around us, dealing damage like it normally would. This is basically just another free auto-casting static orb. After that, we will be going over and taking the 3 points into Lunar Eclipse. What this does is it gives us an additional 18% less damage taken during Flame Rush, and then that effect is doubled against damage over time. Next, we'll be taking the 3 points into Celestial Guidance. What this will do is it makes it so the buff for the damage reduction from the previous node is going to apply for a certain duration after Flame Rush ends. So that way, while we're still casting abilities and trying to kill stuff, we're still getting this massive damage reduction, especially to dots. So it will be 45% of the duration that we are in Flame Rush. It will be applied to us after Flame Rush ends. Next up, we'll be taking the 3 points into Solar Rush. This is going to increase the speed at which you travel while you are in Flame Rush and increase the distance. So it's going to make it feel a lot smoother and a little bit less clunky while you're. Next, we'll be taking the 3 points into Blazing Flux. This is going to decrease the mana cost of Flame Rush a little bit, but more importantly, it is going to increase the cooldown recovery speed so we can be moving more often. Next, we'll be taking the additional 2 points into Lunar Protection, so we're getting a little bit more ward when we're using our. Okay, after that, we're going to be taking a couple different nodes. These nodes may change the more I'm able to test them, but I just wanted to mess around with it there just as an additional source of damage, as there's not really a clear path to take here that's going to make really a massive impact. So for the next 3 points, I'm going to be taking Mana Fuse Current. So Flame Rush deals more damage per 40 current mana. Since we are stacking a massive amount of mana, this might be a nice little additional clear for a lot of the small, weaker mobs as we're flame rushing into them. And then also I'm going to be grabbing the last point into Blazeborn, just increasing that area of effect of the explosion at the end of Flame Rush a little bit more and adding a little bit more damage fire there. The only other option we would really take that would make sense to us is maybe grabbing like Ember Wake with a Signet of Ash points there, basically shooting out these little fire projectiles at enemies, just in the hopes that those small procs will proc the spark charges from the offhand that we're using. We only have like a 10% chance to proc spark charges that way, so it's really minute damage. So we'll mess around with it and see kind of what we end up landing. But then that will wrap up the Flame Rush tree for us. For the final ability, I am going to be using Focus. I know a lot of people are going to be having a deep sigh here and like, oh no, another mage build using Focus. I don't think this is going to be mandatory late game. Once I kind of fine tune all of my gear and get a much larger mana pool, as the more mana I get, the more mana regen it's going to give me, and I think eventually I will be able to fully fix the mana problem. However, when you're starting off a cycle, you're not going to have a lot of gear, you're not going to have a lot of shards to craft with. This is a really good just kind of band-aid fix for mana problems, but once I finish fleshing out the build, I will make a new update that's not using this. How Focus works, for those of you that are not used to it, is you hold it down and channel it, and while you're channeling, it gives you 100% increased mana regen and gain 10 ward per second. After channeling for exactly 1 second, you recover 10% of your missing mana and gain a burst of 40 mana. So just a really good mana tool to help you regen your mana rather quickly. How we will be scaling this out is we will be starting with the 2 points into Mana Flooded. So instead of 100% increased mana regen, we're going to be getting 150% while we are channeling. Next up, we'll be grabbing the point into Desperate Meditation. What this does is it increases the mana regen per missing mana. So with us having such a large mana pool, it is going to give us a drastic increase in the actual mana that we're getting per second. Next up, we'll be grabbing the Null Profusion. How that works is you get casting Focus while at negative mana instantly grants mana equal to a percentage of your maximum mana. So it will give you, let's see, so maximum mana gained while negative will be at 20% per second. and then it adds an additional 5 second to the cooldown. So essentially, what this is going to do, paired with Null Infusion, is casting Focus while at negative mana instantly grants the mana equal to percentage of your maximum mana. Is you're going to cast your abilities as you normally would. Don't worry about ever touching focus until you see your mana become a negative value. If your mana becomes a negative value, you tap focus and you hold it down for like 1 second, and it is going to instantly give you about half of your mana back. So if you have 1,000 mana, it's going to give you about like 500-ish mana back instantly. And then if you aren't getting attacked by any monsters and you have some extra time and you just want to fill up your mana, you can keep holding it down. It'll give you the other half of your mana back. But this is a rather quick way to just instantly recover that mana to keep fighting if you're fighting like on a big boss or something that's taking a lot of hits to kill. After that, we'll be taking the additional 2 points into Mana Flooded to increase the mana regen by an additional 50%. Then we'll be taking the 4 points into Revelation. This is going to give you an additional 100 ward from the burst that you get after channeling for 1 second, and an additional 20 mana. Next, we'll be grabbing the 1 point into Energy Infusion. What this will basically do is give you haste for 1 second per 20 mana you gained while channeling, to a maximum of 10 seconds. Since we have so much mana we're going to be getting back from this, it's pretty much always going to give us the 10-second haste, just allowing us to move a lot faster. That way we can run around and dodge mechanics a little. After that, we'll be taking the 4 points into Iron Stance. What this does is it gives you 48% more armor, and grants you additional armor based on your intelligence. This is an intelligence stacking build, so you're getting 12 intelligence, or 12 armor per intelligence, and then the 48% more on top of that. So on a decently geared build, you should be, over 130 intelligence. So that's going to be a lot of extra armor. So it's going to practically armor cap you just off this one node while you're casting focus, making it very unlikely for you to die while doing it. And then for the last point, we're going to put it into Calm Mind. What this does is the instant mana gained from the previous 2 nodes, the Null Infusion and the Null Profusion, is also going to convert that mana over to ward. And then it adds a little bit of extra cooldown to it, but it doesn't really matter. You don't really have to use focus that often. And that's going to wrap up all of the different skills for the build. So hopefully the build is starting to make sense on the different synergies that are taking place. And then as we go through the passive trees, that will start kind of putting together the build there for you as you're seeing the different synergies come together. All right, next up is going to be our passive tree. Just like the skills, we're going to have the slider bar at the bottom so you can kind of follow along with me. For the first 8 points, we're going to be putting them into Arcanus. This is going to give us +8 intelligence. Intelligence is going to be very important on this build as we'll get into the items, but it will also give us 4% increased damage for both our Lightning Blast and our Static Orb per point of intelligence, as well as intelligence by default gives us ward retention to help keep that ward on us for a longer period of time. In addition, it will also give us the 24% fire and lightning res. After that, we'll be taking 2 points into Scholar for the flat health and mana. Then we'll be taking the 5 points into Mage Flurry, giving us 15% cast speed. The 3-point bonus does not do anything for us since we are not using Teleport or Snap Freeze. And for the remaining 5 points in the Mage passive tree to give us a total of 20 points, we are putting them into Knowledge of Destruction for the 35% critical strike chance and 15% critical strike multiplier. Then after that, we'll be going into the Sorcerer skill tree. We'll be speccing in as a Sorcerer. By default, this is going to give us an additional 50 flat mana, and then spell damage increase is increase equal to its mana cost, and that will actually be a more multiplier now, instead of before just giving us a percentile increase, making Sorcerer and large mana cost abilities much more effective now. For the first 5 points, you'll be going into Calculated Destruction for even more intelligence, and then also giving us the 5-point bonus where we get increased spell critical strike chance per intelligence. We're going to get 3% spell crit per intelligence from that, which will be massive to help us kind of get to that capped crit chance. After that, we'll be taking the 5 points into Mana Shell. Mana Shell has been reworked coming into the second cycle here, where we get the 20 flat mana and the ward per second like normal. But now we have a 5-point bonus where we get ward per second per 10 maximum mana, which is a really large amount since we're going to be getting over 1,000 ward. We're just now getting a whole bunch of free ward per second. Next up after that, we'll be grabbing the 6 points into a Wisdom. So this is the same as it was in the previous cycle. It's going to give us more flat mana, increased mana regen. Then the 6-point bonus is we get increased mana regen per 100 of maximum mana. So this is going to give us a lot of free mana regen. Next up, we'll be grabbing the 5 points into Lost Knowledge. So you gain ward based on your current mana when you use a skill that costs at least 40 mana. This is going to automatically be proccing when our static orb is being auto-cast from our evades and our flame rush to give us a very good chunk of mana each cast. After that, we'll be putting the 1 travel point here for the increased lightning damage and the shock chance, but more importantly to give us access to Rift Bolt, where we'll be putting 5 points into it. This will give us 15% lightning penetration, as well as 1.5% of lightning damage leached as health. We hopefully won't get to our health pool very often, as we're going to be using both ward and mana to kind of absorb a lot of that damage. But in case we do take any damage, this will help us leech back that health that we're missing. After that, we'll be switching over to the Rune Master tree briefly to put 5 points into Sphere of Protection. This is going to give us some flat health, as well as make us take less damage from shocked enemies. This is really important because it's going to give us access to the Flame Rush ability, which we will not be able to spec into until we get these 5 points into this tree. After that, we'll be taking, moving back over to the Sorcerer tree and taking 3 points into Crackling Precision for an additional 30% critical strike chance. And then we'll be going into one of the newly reworked nodes, Arcane Insight. So it's going to give us an additional 8 intelligence, and there's also a new 8-point bonus that's going to give us ward decay threshold per intelligence. So this is kind of similar to how ward retention works, except this kind of helps prevent you from going lower than a certain amount of ward from decaying at all. So this will help us just keep an overall higher ward pool. After that, we'll be putting 2 points for right now into Arcane Obliteration to get the 20% spell critical strike multiplier. And then we'll be putting the 4 points into Arcane Current. This is going to make you deal more damage to shocked enemies, as well as a 4-point bonus that's brand new, where your skills, which cost at least 40 mana, aka Static Orb, it is going to have a 100% chance to apply a Spark Charge on hit. So that will apply spark charges to everything that Static Orb passes through. After that, we'll take the 1 more point to Arcane Obliteration for right now, just getting access to this last row on the passive tree, in which case we'll be taking the 5 points into Archmage. This is one of the coolest passive points that they added with coming into this new cycle that has really helped change around what Sorcerer is able to do now. So how it works is it gives you additional flat spell damage, and you have a chance to refund a portion of the mana cost of your skill's use. So by default, it's going to give us 5 flat damage, and then you are going to have a 35% chance to refund 20% of the mana cost of that spell. And then with the bottom portion here, the values are doubled with 300 mana. So what that means is if you have at least 300 maximum mana, is going to give you 10 flat spell damage, and then it is going to give you a 70% chance to refund 20% of your mana. And then there's an additional threshold at 1,000 maximum mana where the values are tripled. That means it's going to give you 15 flat damage with a 100% chance to refund 20% of the mana cost of your spell. That's going to really help synergize well with the Static Orb, with giving us a huge chunk of that mana back, on top of our Lightning Blast shenanigans, also giving us a chunk of that back. So we're basically going to be getting about 45% of the mana cost that we spend on Static Orb returned back to us immediately. Next up, we'll be taking the 3 points into Mana Well. This is going to give us 9% increased mana, which is a brand new node, as well as the 3-point bonus that's going to give us 50% of the mana spent gained as ward. We are going to be spending a metric shit ton of mana, and so that is in turn going to give us a metric shit ton of ward back. So really, really solid node. After that, we'll take out the remaining points of Arcane Obliteration to get the 50% spell critical strike multiplier. And then we'll be taking the 10 points into Mana Bulwark. This is going to give us an additional 40 flat mana, as well as 20% of the damage dealt is going to be damage to our mana pool instead of our health pool. Just giving us that additional layer of defense for stacking mana. Next up, we're going to be grabbing the remainder points into Sphere of Protection on the Rune Master tree for the additional less damage taken. We'll be taking 1 point into Unsealed Mana. There is a cooldown on the burst mana for this, and we don't really stack a lot of cast speed, as well as we have to be using an ability to cost 0 mana, which we no longer have with this setup. So this is mainly just going to be a travel point. We're going to be putting 1 point into Arcane Focus. So we're not casting super fast like we were before. The ward gain on direct spell cast is more minute than it used to be on the Mana Lightning build. And then we'll be putting the 6 points in True Transcendence. What this does gives us 72 flat mana, as well as the 6-point bonus that gives us 12 ward per second. And additional ward, as long as we have 60 intelligence, is going to give us an additional 24. So a lot of just ward generated per second passively without having to do anything. And then we'll be taking the 6 points into Mental Catalysis. What this does gives us additional 6 intelligence while wielding a catalyst, which we will be. And then the bonus damage from critical strikes is going to be reduced by 36%. Pretty much every build in the game, you're going to want to either get 100% critical strike avoidance or 100% reduced damage taken from critical strikes. This gives us a good chunk towards that kind of threshold that we need to hit for our build to be defensively sound. And then for the last 6 points, we're going to be putting them into Inscribed Instruments. What this will do is we're going to be using a wand for the build, so it's going to give us an additional 40% critical strike multiplier. And then that is going to wrap up all of the passives for the build. Hopefully everything's starting to come together for you, and as we start going over the gear portion of the build, it will start making a lot more sense. Alrighty, now that we've gone over the skills and the passive trees, I am going to start breaking down the different gear I'm going to use. The first thing I want to go over is the uniques I kind of have in the starter setup of the build, and then I'm also going to go over some of the chase uniques that you can go for an end game version of the build, and then we'll kind of start breaking down the stat priorities. I'm not going to go over all the locations for each of the items. I'll probably break that down a little bit more once the cycle starts, as a lot of that information hasn't been made public yet, and I don't want to get in trouble for disclosing some of that. So for the first item, kind of the main focus of the build, we have the Tribo Electra, which basically what it does is a new wand that gives us a bunch of lightning spell levels, so you get 2 to 3 levels to all lightning spell skills. It's going to add an additional 2 to 5 tendrils to your static orbs, which are going to apply more spark charges. You're going to get increased shock duration. And then the really big part here is when you use Evade, you cast Static Orb for 90% of its mana. We're going to have that 10% mana reduction, which is really nice. And it's going to give us that kind of auto bomber feel to the character, where we're going to be casting kind of in a rotation of Evade, Lightning Blast, Evade, Lightning Blast, just to kind of move around and just have all this automatic damage circling around us. It also is going to make it so all of the shocks on you are transferred to nearby enemies. I don't really care about that one too much. I'm not self-inflicting any shocks to myself. And then also it gives you a 35% increased cooldown recovery speed for your evade. It also, if you didn't read the patch notes, you do get increased cooldown recovery for your evade for every level of your character. So by the time you get to like level 100 and you're using this wand, you should have about like a 2-second evade cooldown. So every 2 seconds, you're getting that free static orb that's going to be circling around you, doing all the damage for you. Next up, we have the Fragment of Enigma. Anyone that's played my previous build, the Mana Lightning Rune Master, is going to be familiar with this guy. So how it works is it gives you a 12% chance to apply a Spark Charge on hit. I know we broke down spark charges on the lightning blast tree, but basically a negative ailment that gets applied on the enemy that explodes after a duration, dealing massive lightning damage. And are with the Enigma here, we're also going to be getting the 2 lightning damage for spark charge per intelligence. So it's going to give us a lot of flat lightning damage. So with 132 intelligence, we're basically going to be doubling that. So we're going to get what 264 flat lightning damage for our spark charge explosions. That's a lot of extra damage. And then also we're going to be getting up to a 240% increased spark charge explosion area. So this is going to be a good chunk of our area clear. Most of our single target is going to be coming from static orb itself, but the area clear is all going to be coming from the fragment of the Enigma, just chain exploding entire packs. And then the other important part for us is going to give us another +1 to level of lightning skills. And then the remaining 2 stats don't actually impact us at all. We're not doing any melee damage, and we're not using teleport. Next, we have the Phantom Grip. This is another new unique item to Cycle 2. What this does is most of these stats are useless on it, but rings don't really offer you a whole lot of stats outside of intelligence that really make that much of an impact. However, this ring gives you something no other ring has been able to give you before. It gives you base critical strike chance. It gives you up to a 2% base for each ring. By default, your character has 5% base. So you're almost doubling your crit chance from all sources from these 2 rings here, giving you 4% base. And then also, it also happens to have a increased mana stat on there that is not flat mana. It's actually a percentile mana. So you're getting 16% increased mana with using the 2 rings. So just a really good all-rounder ring. It's a really low level. You're going to run into them while you're going through the campaign, I'm sure. I normally was getting, a few of these going through there. So getting 2 of them and getting them with legendary potential is going to be very, very easy with the new Nemesis system. So plan on getting these pretty easy without a lot of hassle. After that, there's a couple of kind of endgame uniques and chase items you can go for. There's a few options that you can go for on the helmet. So the ones to look out for are going to be a prismatic gaze. So you guys are probably familiar with this helmet from previous cycles. It can give you an additional 4% base crit. It's going to give you less elemental damage taken. And then also it's going to give you a chance to shred elemental resistance. So whenever we use our lightning blast, it's going to generate these prism shards for you. And whenever we use static orb, it's going to send those prism shards out to shred off the LE res of nearby monsters. The other option that I'm personally planning on using in the endgame version is the new helmet, Seed of Edgersel. So how that works out is it gives you a bunch of flat mana and mana regen. It also gives you up to 28% of the damage dealt to mana before health, so an additional defense with having that massive mana pool. And then the really unique stat here is it gives you up to 56% of endurance is applied to all damage dealt to mana. So why that's super important is how endurance normally works is you have what's called an endurance threshold. So you can see mine currently says 213. So what this does is when you are below 213 health, or you take a hit that brings you below 213 health, it reduces that damage by the amount of your endurance percentage. So mine's currently 44%. So 44% of the damage would be reduced up to a cap of 60%. So the reason why the wording on this helmet is so interesting is that you don't care about your endurance threshold. 56% of your endurance, your percentage, so if you're capped out at 60%, it's gonna be like roughly like 32, 33% of that damage is negated to all of the damage dealt to your mana. So you don't need to be below your endurance threshold. Your endurance threshold doesn't apply to your mana. It's just all of your mana pool is protected by your endurance percentage. On top of that, you're going to get a little bit of extra endurance threshold for your health based on your maximum health. That part doesn't really matter since we're not stacking health, so it's going to be pretty minute. We get a little bit of extra health, and then we get a 4 to 8% chance to take 0 damage when hit. I'm sure that's going to have some funny moments when we tank like a giant Orbis Meteor, and then we just take 0 damage. It's not too much of a proc chance, but it is a little something on top. So that's probably the helmet I'm planning on using. The one thing you do want to look out for is you don't actually want to use a Fractured Crown. While it does give you a lot of crit and crit multi and mana and damage dealt to mana before health, it does have the unfortunate stat of you cannot have ward. This is typically what mana stackers would use in the end game. However, they added a lot of new passives now in the sorcerer tree that gives us a lot of free ward generation, where I think this is actually going to no longer be the go-to. I think the new helmet is going to outweigh it, but we'll see what happens when I start pushing high end game with the new cycle drops. An additional unique that you can kind of use as a chase item is if you can get an unstable core with legendary potential on it is a really good option. It uses the Arcane Regalia base, so you're still getting the 14% increase in mana. This Elemental Nova node here, or stat here, is completely useless, but it still gives you 115% increased elemental damage, 120 mana, and +1 to basically all the mage skills. And then on top of that, if you get legendary potential, you can slam on there intelligence. You can slam on more flat mana, more damage dealt to mana. Basically, any of these stats you can just put on top of this chest. So if you can at least get the intelligence and maybe one other good stat, I think this is a really good viable option that you can switch to. I probably wouldn't use this if it was didn't have any legendary potential on it though. If you didn't have anything better, then yeah, it's a pretty good chest piece. But if you have any kind of decent exalted armor, it's probably going to be better until you get one with a couple stats slammed on top of it. Another really good unique item that you could use for endgame is if you're able to get a Blood of the Exile with some legendary potential on it. This pair of boots comes with a 40% kind of base movement speed, as well as it gives you 12 intelligence. So if you're able to slam some like movement speed and additional intelligence on top of that, it can be a really strong endgame item. The other thing that should be fairly common to use is the Knowledge of an Erased Mage. So this is going to give you the same base as the Warding Scroll. So you get the 40 mana and the 40% of mana spent gain as ward, but you're going to gain +1 to level of all mage skills and an additional 9% of damage dealt to mana before health. And then you also do get an additional endurance threshold to your health pool per 10 missing mana. So that should basically cover a majority of your health pool. It's just always been covered by endurance if you do run out of your so you're going to be looking for most of the stats that are on here. So just trying to get some intelligence, some mana, some critical strike multiplier, spell crit, stuff like that slammed on here. This is a Weaver's Will unique, so it's going to be kind of random. You're going to have to go through a few of these until you get the stats you're looking for. But this is going to be a really good option once you do get that. And that's most of the uniques that I'm going to be looking for. As far as the idols go, we're going to be looking for some grand idols with mana and increase armor and mana on there. Some other options that you could go for if you can't get the stat is you can also get the mana spent gained as ward. That's also a really strong option. And then we'll be grabbing some 1x3s, give you increased cast speed while you have Lightning Aegis, which you should have all of the time as long as you've cast Static Orb recently, and some Ellie Res. You can also get any other type of resistance on here, or honestly, even health. Is not too bad. And then for the 1x1 idols, we're looking for mana and Ellie Res. And then next up, we have our blessings. The blessings should be much easier to acquire now with the new blessing system. You'll have to read the patch notes to get more details about that. But what I'll be going for is critical strike multiplier on the Black Sun timeline, increased mana on the Ending Storm timeline, 20% all res on the Reigns of Dragon, 55% increased armor on Age of Winter, and 30% endurance on the Spirits of Fire. So I think those are by far going to be the best in slots for the different locations. The locations I didn't put on here only give you increases to drop rate and not increases to your actual character, so I left those blank for now. And that's going to wrap up all of the passives, the skills, the gearing, and whatnot. I'll have all the stat priorities here on the regular pieces of gear of what you'll be looking for. I don't want to make this video too long, as I'm going to have to repeat a lot of this here in a couple of days when I make the more in-depth version of the build guide that I'm known for, where I'll go over kind of where to get all the pieces of gear, how to craft any of the gear that you're looking for. But this should give you a general idea on what I'm going to be playing for my league start, and how I'm going to be playing it. Again, I'm not going to be doing the early levels as this build. I'm going to be probably playing a Mana Glacier build early on, just because it's super easy to get going. You get Glacier very, very early on in the game. You kind of just one-shot everything with it during those earlier levels. So I'll have a link in the build video just of a like leveling planner and setup for that. And then I will be updating this video with some loot filters here in the next day or two. I wanted to get this video out for one of my buddies who's making a video based on what a couple of us are league starting. So I will be updating that here soon. So I apologize, I don't have that for you right now. I just try to put a lot of love into my my loot filters and make sure they're well set up for you guys. I am planning on playing Merchant this cycle, so my loot filters are going to be a little bit different. They're going to have a little bit more bloat on them for stuff that sells really well. I'll try to make it very obvious what those are in the loot filters. That way you can uncheck them if you're playing Circle of Fortune and you don't want to see those on there. But other than that, that's going to wrap up the video. So if you guys did enjoy the video, consider giving the video a like or subscribing to my YouTube channel. If you also want to check me out while I'm playing these builds live, it's just twitch.tv/Pinchingloaf. So same thing as my YouTube, and you guys can come hang out, ask questions, see what I'm working on next. We're going to be really fine-tuning this build here over the next like week or two. Playing on Merchant, I'm going to be able to min-max this a lot more than I have been on previous builds with playing Circle of Fortune. And then we'll kind of go from there, guys. So a lot more videos to come, a lot more content. I'm planning on streaming very long days over the next couple of days of the cycle start, and we'll go from there. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I will catch you on the next one. See ya.